Delighted to be here, everybody. Your Royal Highnesses, ladies and gentlemen, what a amazing set of imagery to remind us of the beauty and the challenges facing the ocean. But perhaps before I introduce the panel, just a couple of thoughts to get you thinking about this. So first off, every second breath we take is from the ocean. So 50% of the oxygen that is produced globally comes from a healthy ocean. A third of the carbon that is taken up by the ocean. 90% of the heat that we produce is taken up by the ocean. So you can imagine the amazing services it plays in our lives around the world. But if that wasn't enough, over 3 billion, that's 3 billion people, rely on protein from the ocean. And so it is a critical element, to our lives. But we know that the ocean is facing challenges, and we saw many of those challenges just now. But maybe just a couple more, just to add to your woes. 90% of all the fish in the ocean is either overexploited or is at fishing at capacity. 53% of the fish we eat is coming from aquaculture. And we know with an increasingly hungrier population around the world, we need to make provisions and think about where that protein is going to come from. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panelist. Beatrice Crona, who is the Deputy Science Director of the Stockholm Resilience Facility and affiliated with the Royal Swedish Academy. And Pawan Patil, who is a senior economist from the World Bank and serial social entrepreneur. Please.
Thank you.
So let's start with you, Beatrice. You obviously heard some of the challenges that from our previous presenter and some of the challenges that, of course, the ocean is facing. How are we going to produce that same amount of protein if we want to continue to feed this growing population?
So there's no quick and easy answer to that, and you asked me to be brief, but I will say, of course, that as we heard from the previous speaker, ensuring the environmental health of our oceans and our freshwater systems as well is paramount. You can't emphasize that enough, and we heard very eloquently about a number of these very alarming trends, whether it's biodiversity loss, massive amounts of plastics, chemical pollution, nutrient leakage, and so on. I think all of those are super important. But also I want to mention perhaps pending large-scale investments into other ocean sectors, which go often under the banner of the blue economy. And I wanted to just take a moment to reflect on that, because I think the blue economy discussion has had a tendency to really emphasize all the opportunities that exist, and which I agree with, but it's not been really well enough articulated that there are some very real and significant trade-offs as well as we embark on the blue economy between, for example, deep sea mining, shallow water aggregates, and blue food production, for example. And this brings me to my last point in regard to that question, which is when we talk about blue food production, we need to be really clear that it's both capture fisheries, which is our last wild resource, really, and it's aquaculture. And while the projected needs for increased blue food production is really looked at to aquaculture to provide that, we need to make sure that capture does not decline. And there are still some really remaining threats there. For example, curbing the still very eminent illegal activities and illegal extractive activities. So
obviously still a number of problems. And so what we really want to do is part of this panel is to get to some of the solutions. We don't want to leave you just hanging with here a laundry list of problems. So we want to get to almost that to-do list. So Pawan, you described yourself as a serial social entrepreneur. And so, it's a wonderful expression. So can you give us a little bit about the solutions? You're moving in various circles in the World Bank. You've worked in the field. You're now in a very unique position to provide some insights in this. So can you give us a sense for some of these solutions that we really need to be getting at?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kristian, and it's a delight to be here. When I think about these solutions, I like to call them aquatic food-based solutions. And when you think about it, they fall into 3 different types. The first type happens to be around food-grade fish that are quite nutritious. The second type happens to be around edible aquatic plants. And the third solutions that are derived in this area are around disruptive and innovative technology. So before I go into the detail a little bit about each of those solution areas, let me talk about what they all have in common. And essentially, they have a couple things in common. The first thing they have in common is that they actually have double or triple dividends in terms of social, environmental, and economic benefits. The second thing they have in common is that they have the ability to actually create livelihoods and jobs for millions of people, particularly those at the bottom of the pyramid. And the third thing they have in common is the opportunity to have sustainability at its focus that allows us to actually help achieve the planetary boundaries. Now let me get into the details of what each of these types so you actually have a picture of what these are. So in terms of the food grade fish type examples, what scientists have shown us is that not all fish are created equal. In fact, scientists have actually showed that if you actually look at the nutritional profile of different fish, some are actually more nutritious than others. And what's interesting about that is this really matters, because when we do randomized controlled trials, and scientists have done this, and have fed, for example, nutritious fish, or we call them nutrifish, to pregnant and lactating women and children over 1,000 days, you're finding a decline in the probability of childhood stunting. And why that matters is because it has a direct impact between 3 to 15% of GDP for nations. So finance ministers and heads of state need to understand that nutritious food, and even food from fish-based sources, have incredible potential to be transformative. And it brings different communities together, the nutrition community, the agriculture community, the fisheries community, and all of us as healthy eaters and the food-based community. The second, with respect to aquatic plants. So the interesting thing here is around two, algae and seaweed. So let's talk about marine algae first and foremost. The reality is that randomized controlled trials, again, around marine algae have shown that actually if you consume marine algae, they're incredibly nutritious. And actually they can change your well-being at a very cellular level. The second, when it comes down to seaweed, is seaweed cultivation is something that has been able to move fishers who are traditionally involved in overfishing areas into seaweed cultivation. And that has produced not only a nutritious food, but also an input to different industries, like the cosmetic industry, or actually in the overall food industry. What I mean by that is something like gelatin, where it actually has produced a plant-based solution that substitutes away from animal sources. So imagine that. And in the third area, when it comes down to innovative or destructive technology, I wanted to share two really important points. One is that there's these different technologies that allow us to use plant-based modalities and plant-based feed to actually feed fish, farmed fish in particular, that then we eat. So just imagine if we're able to use plant-based fish feed, substitute away from fish eating fish in order to produce fish for us to eat, no matter how nutritious they are. Just imagine the double and triple dividend that occurs from that plant-based diet of not only humans, but also of the fish. And with respect to that, I'd like to point out that in the EAT Forum, there have been several partners that have actually been able to create these innovative technologies around algae and microbes. And in fact, what we're finding is that these algae and microbes are not only able to help feed fish, but help feed the salmon industry, which is very important to Nordic countries as well.
So you raise actually a very important point. That's an important reminder to us all. You know, often we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in silos. You know, certainly within the communities I move in the ocean world, SDG 14 is is the pillar of that community. But increasingly, what we need to do if we want to deliver on these 176 odd targets underneath these 14 or 17 goals, we need to start connecting the dots on this. And certainly, one of the areas that Blue Food certainly can offer is around addressing production consumption. Issues around gender, well-being, peace and security, climate change. I mean, the list goes on. And so if you're thinking about in terms of hedging one's bets, I mean, it's a pretty good bet, I would say, as far as thinking about some of the things you mentioned, Pawan, about some of these solution sets. So let me just turn to you, Beatrice, and perhaps reflect on that. This the SDGs, and going forward, how is this going to shape these aquatic and marine food systems going forward? I mean, what does that look like heading forward?
Well, I don't know, but I think the one important point that I wanted to make here which is very simple, but it's fundamental. And it's the fact that, contrary to, I think, how we often think or talk or even make policy about this, even how we conduct our science, is that aquatic foods are firmly embedded in and also instrumentally linked to the rest of the food system, and particularly the agricultural sector. And this harks back to what Pawan was just talking about, feeds. Because if we look at it, currently over 50% of all seafood that we consume in the world is farmed. And that's going to increase because aquaculture is the fastest growing food sector, you could say, in the world. But it's also extremely highly dependent on feed still, with the exclusion of filter feeders. So there you go, mussels, bivalves, and also carps, of course. But with the exclusion of those, we see that most of the aquaculture is fed aquaculture. That's over 70% of the aquaculture today. And that's being fed a mix currently of seafood-derived and some plant-based, increasingly plant-based in the mix for sure. But as you just pointed out, there's a lot to be gained there. But the trend, unfortunately, I think we're seeing is that the increase over the last few decades in the fed aquaculture. So we need to change, we need to shift that. And I think that therein lies the challenge here to have aquaculture develop in such a way that it provides healthy, nutritious, and sustainable source of protein, but also that it does it in a way that is equitable. So, because we still have large portions of the populations out there who are highly dependent on seafood, particularly, or aquatic foods for their protein. And I just wanted to say another point, which I think it really ties back to what you were illustrating, that seafood is such a diverse food group.
Yeah,
if we compare it to some of the terrestrial food groups that we have, like our crops, but even our meat production, seafood, as you know, is like hundreds of different species that we that's included in that. And of course, they have vastly different environmental footprints as well as health and nutritional profiles. And I think we mustn't lose sight of that diversity, but that's also one of the challenges as we move ahead, because even within science, we know a lot, but we don't have a firm grasp of the diversity of those profiles, both environmental impact and nutritious, and I think that's really where we need to move with science as well. I think we're about to, but we're not there yet.
And so I'm going to come back to that point on science, because I think it's extremely important. But you know, when you talk, Beatrice, when you talk about some of these big food systems, aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food production sectors. You know, that's going to require business and big business, right? So, Pawan, can you tell us a little bit about sort of thoughts on the role of the private sector in this? Because obviously it's going to have a major role and impact going forward. So can you give us some quick thoughts on that?
Great, thanks very much. So when it comes down to the private sector, and as an economist and a banker, what I basically figured out by doing a back of the envelope calculation is that $180 billion a year is actually invested in improving nutrition, essentially. But only 5% is from the public sector. But less than a quarter of 1% of all that 180 billion is used for food-based solutions, and less than 10% of that is actually aquatic-based solutions. So just imagine that the private sector is actually driving transformations in nutrition, and we have the same opportunity, because of the knowledge and the evidence base, to ensure that the private sector is at the center of nutritious food and the transformation around aquatic foods that are nutritious as well.
So that sounds like big finance. I mean, it sounds like in order to enable that, we're going to need a lot of money and a lot of resources that's going to be directed into that. So, Beatrice, briefly on that, give us a little sense about. I know you've been thinking a lot about finance. The Stockholm Resilience Center has been thinking about this a lot. Can you just give us a quick snapshot on kind of some big picture thinking on finance going forward in this issue?
Sure, and I think it's great to sit with a banker talking about this on stage, but because I believe that the kind of finance you're talking about is also a lot of it coming from the public sector, from governments, but there is a phenomenal amount of capital floating around on capital markets that are being invested, and I think that has a potential to be a real incentive and a driver towards both nutritious and sustainable seafood as well. And I think some of the work that we've been doing recently, it just shows that there are multiple leverage points in the kind of what I call mainstream finance. And one of them, incidentally, is banks, because the seafood sector, the 53 of the 100 largest companies in this sector are privately held, which means that equity or voice and that kind of thing through engagement with boards, it doesn't exist there. But banks hold the key card there. And so by being much more particular about and articulating sustainability criteria linked to the debt that's being issued or the loans, I think is a massive potential. So I would flag that for bankers all around.
I think that's an important point, because I think often I hear this common refrain of the finance community says, we got lots of money, but we don't see the deals. And so the other sort of small medium enterprise says, we got lots of deals, but we don't see the finance. And I think we really need to spend some sort of effort in bridging that gap so that we can direct that financing. One of the things that in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, the Friends of Ocean Action, the Stockholm Resilience Center, the EAT Foundation, FAO, Stanford, we've put together and initiated here at this conference something called the Blue Food Coalition. And the idea is, can we mobilize the private sector and get ahead of the game to start identifying what are the needs? If we really need to make this transition and feed this population going forward, how are we going to take that forward in a way that's not going to impact the planet, and somehow find that balance between production and protection? And through that, obviously we need the science. And so this is where I hand to you, Beatrice, and maybe tell a little bit the parallel track that we've been working on as far as the science is concerned.
Yeah, so I'm just really happy to be able to say that together, of course, in collaboration with the Blue Food Coalition, but particularly with the co-lead of the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, the Stockholm Resilience Center is just about to launch now a research initiative which we call the Blue Food Assessment, which is geared at really bringing together, I noted a number of gaps, but bringing together what the state-of-the-art of aquaculture, capture fisheries, but also nutrition, and that together to assess and really assess the state-of-the-art science for all these gaps and the diversity that we talked about, and to provide a sort of foundational scientific first step for more actionable, both science, but also, action and policy in the next 18 months. So great hope for that.
It's exciting times. And Gunhild, we've come a long way since that conversation a year ago. So it's wonderful to see that we're here now. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of our session, but it behooves me to say that obviously there are lots of challenges, but there are also lots of solutions. And it behooves us to really think about how we're going to use the ocean and these aquatic spaces to feed this planet, and not at the expense of the planet or the ocean, and not at the expense of people. We can leave no one behind as we go on this journey forward. So thank you very much, and I thank our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much.